Most home gardeners think they have a watering problem. They do not. What they usually have is an exposed soil problem, and that is a very different thing. When the ground sits bare under summer sun, the moisture you paid for, carried, or stood outside to spray simply disappears back into the air. Then the plants begin to struggle, the leaves droop, the fruit slows down, and you end up doing what almost everyone does. You water again and again. And after a while, the whole garden starts to feel less like a system and more like a chore that can never quite keep up with the weather. That is where a lot of people get discouraged. They assume their climate is too hot, their soil is too poor, or their garden just needs more input, more hoses, more fertilizer, more bags from the store. But in many backyards, the real issue is much simpler than that. The ground is being asked to hold life while fully exposed, overheated, and drying out day after day. No natural system works that way for long. I learned this the hard way. There were years when I thought I was doing everything right because I was working hard. I was out there with the hose, checking the beds, trying to stay ahead of the heat. The plants survived, but the system was weak. The garden depended on me for every little thing. If I missed a day in the hottest stretch of summer, the soil told the truth very quickly. It was dry just below the surface, warmer than it should have been, and far less alive than it looked from a distance. That is the part most people are never shown. A garden is not supposed to rely on constant rescue. A healthy backyard system should protect its own moisture, buffer itself from heat, and support the life under the surface that keeps roots steady through long dry spells. Once you see that, a lot of common advice starts to feel backward. You stop asking how to pour in more water, and you start asking why the soil cannot keep the water it already receives. There is a low-cost method that changes that completely. It has been proven in real gardens, used for years by practical growers, and built on something nature has been doing all along. It does not depend on chemicals. It does not require expensive equipment. And when it is done properly, it can turn a thirsty summer garden into something far more stable, cooler, and easier to manage than most people think is possible. The first shift is mental. Most people believe the answer to a dry garden is more effort, more watering, more feeding, more correction. But that way of thinking keeps you trapped in a cycle where the soil never becomes strong enough to help you. You stay busy, yet the garden stays dependent. That is why so many backyard growers feel like they are always one hot week away from losing control. It is not because they are careless. It is because they were taught to manage symptoms instead of building a system. If you look at a natural forest, you begin to notice something uncomfortable. Nobody is out there watering trees in July. Nobody is spreading synthetic fertilizer before a heat wave. Nobody is rushing in to save the soil every afternoon. And yet the ground under a healthy woodland stays cool, moist, and alive even in long periods of heat. That should tell you something. Nature is not winning because it has more water. Nature is winning because it wastes less of it. That is the part that changes everything. In many home gardens, water is not truly scarce. It is simply unprotected. The sun hits bare earth. Wind moves across the surface. Heat drives moisture upward. The top layer hardens, cracks, or crusts over. Then the gardener sees stress above ground and assumes the solution must come from above ground too. Another round of watering, another product, another attempt to push the plants through conditions the soil itself should have been buffering. So the problem is not that you failed. The problem is that you were handed the wrong model. You were taught to focus on the visible plant instead of the invisible ground that supports it. Leaves get attention, fruit gets attention, even pests get attention. But the soil surface, which decides whether moisture stays or disappears, is often left exposed as if that were normal. It is not normal in a living system. Bare soil is not how forests function. Bare soil is not how long-term fertility protects itself. And bare soil is one of the quiet reasons so many gardens need constant help. Once you understand that, a different question appears. Not how do I water more, but how do I lose less? Not how do I force growth, but how do I create conditions where growth is easier? That is a calmer question and usually a more productive one. It leads you away from short-term fixes and toward a method that works with the way soil wants to behave when it is covered, fed, and left cool enough for life to do its job. There is a reason some gardens stay steady through summer, while others become daily emergencies. The difference is often not the gardener's dedication. It is the presence or absence of a protective layer that turns the soil from a thirsty surface into a functioning system. That layer is simple, it is accessible, and once you see how it works, you begin to realize that a great deal of struggle in the backyard was never really necessary in the first place. The method itself is not new. It did not come out of a laboratory or a product line. It came from observation. A man named Paul Gauci spent years looking at what was already working in nature and asking a simple question. Why does the forest grow without help, while so many home gardens struggle with constant input? He noticed something most people walk past without thinking. The ground in a forest is never bare. It is always covered. Leaves fall. Small branches break down. Organic matter builds up layer by layer until the soil underneath is protected from direct sun, strong wind, and sudden temperature changes. That layer does more than just sit there. It regulates moisture. It feeds life. It creates a quiet stability that allows roots to function without stress. From that observation came what is now often called the back to Eden approach. But at its core, it is simply a return to a pattern that has always worked. Instead of leaving soil exposed, you cover it with a thick layer of organic material. In this case, wood chips. Not mixed into the soil, not tilled in, but laid gently on top like a protective blanket. At first, that might seem too simple to matter. Many people have heard of mulching. They might even use a thin layer now and then. But this is not a light covering. This is a deliberate system. The difference is in the depth and the consistency. A thin layer dries out quickly and does very little. A deep layer changes the environment completely. When wood chips are placed on the surface, something subtle begins to happen. The sunlight no longer strikes the soil directly. The temperature at the surface drops. Moisture that would normally evaporate stays in place. Rainwater or irrigation does not hit bare ground and disappear. It moves slowly through the layer, settling into the soil below, where roots can actually use it. At the same time, life begins to return. Fungi, bacteria, and small organisms move into the space between the chips and the soil. They begin breaking down the material from the bottom up. This is important. The process is slow and steady, not aggressive. It feeds the soil gradually without the spikes and crashes that often come from fast-acting inputs. You do not see this immediately from above. The surface still looks simple, but underneath the system is becoming more balanced. The soil is cooler, it is softer, it holds water longer. Roots begin to explore more freely because they are not dealing with extreme swings in moisture and heat. That is why this method works over time. It is not forcing growth, it is removing stress. And when stress is reduced, plants tend to do what they are designed to do. They grow steadily, they produce more consistently, and they require less constant attention from you. What started as a simple observation in a forest becomes a practical method in a backyard. Not a trick, not a shortcut, but a system built on protecting what is already there. Once you understand that, the next step is to look more closely at what this layer is actually doing below the surface, because that is where the real change begins. Once the layer is in place, the change does not happen all at once. It happens quietly below the surface, in ways that are easy to miss if you are only looking at the plants. But this is where the system begins to work. Think of the wood chips as a barrier, but not a sealed one. Air can still move through it. Water can still pass through it. What it blocks is direct exposure. Sunlight no longer strikes the soil with full intensity. Wind no longer pulls moisture straight out of the ground. The surface is no longer forced to heat up and dry out within hours. Instead, the soil begins to settle into a more stable rhythm. On a hot day, if you move the chips aside with your hand, you will notice the difference immediately. The ground underneath feels cooler, it feels slightly damp, even when the surface above looks dry. That is not an accident. The layer is slowing evaporation to the point where water stays available longer than you might expect. Instead of watering every day, the soil begins to hold enough moisture to carry plants through longer periods without stress. Temperature matters just as much as water. When soil overheats, root activity slows down. Nutrient uptake becomes less efficient. Microbial life begins to decline. But under a thick layer of wood chips, the temperature remains lower and more consistent. It does not spike in the afternoon and crash at night. It stays within a range that supports life rather than working against it. This is where the system goes deeper. Under that protective layer, fungi begin to spread, not in a harmful way, but in a connective one. You may not see them clearly, but they are there, forming fine threads through the soil and organic matter. These fungal networks link with plant roots and extend their reach. In a sense, the roots are no longer working alone. They are part of a larger system that helps move water and nutrients more efficiently through the soil. Over time, this creates a kind of balance that is difficult to achieve with exposed ground. Water is not lost as quickly. Nutrients are not washed away or burned off by heat. The soil structure improves as organic matter breaks down gradually from below. It becomes softer, easier to work with, and more capable of holding both air and moisture at the same time. Weeds also behave differently in this environment. Many of them rely on direct light hitting the soil to germinate. When that light is blocked, their growth slows down, not completely, but enough that they are easier to manage. Instead of constant pulling and clearing, you find yourself dealing with fewer and weaker weeds over time. None of this is dramatic in a single day. That is important to understand. This is not a quick fix. It is a shift in how the system functions. You are not adding something to force results. You are creating conditions where the soil can begin to regulate itself again. And once that regulation begins, your role changes. You are no longer trying to correct problems every afternoon. You are maintaining a system that is already doing most of the work quietly, beneath the surface, where it matters most. Once you understand how the system works, the next question becomes practical. How do you actually do this in a real backyard without turning it into a complicated project or an expensive upgrade? The good part is that the setup is simple, and most of the cost can be avoided if you approach it the right way. The material you are looking for is not bagged mulch from a garden center. That works, but it is not necessary, and over time it becomes expensive. What you want are fresh wood chips, the kind produced when trees are trimmed or removed in your local area. These are usually a mix of branches, leaves, and small shredded pieces of wood. Not perfectly uniform, but that is actually better for the system. In many places, tree service companies have to pay to dispose of these chips. They collect them throughout the day, and then they need somewhere to drop them off. If you offer your space as that drop location, you are solving a problem for them. That changes the dynamic. You are not asking for a favor, you are providing a convenient option. Sometimes it is as simple as calling a local company and telling them you are willing to accept a load of wood chips. In some areas, there are also services like Chip Drop that connect homeowners with arborists who need to unload. The details vary depending on where you live, but the principle is the same. There is usually more of this material available than people realize, and much of it can be obtained at little to no cost. Once the chips arrive, you do not need to overthink the process. You are not mixing them into the soil. You are not digging them in. You are simply placing them on top. That is an important detail. The system works from the surface down, not the other way around. For most garden beds, a depth somewhere between 15 and 30 centimeters is enough to create a noticeable effect. Thinner than that, and the protection is limited. Thicker than that, and you may slow things down more than necessary, especially in the beginning. You can adjust over time, but starting within that range gives the soil a proper layer to work with. If you are planting into the bed, you can gently move the chips aside, place your plant into the soil, and then pull the chips back around it without covering the stem. The goal is to keep the soil protected while still giving the plant space to establish itself. After that, you leave the layer in place and let the system begin. Watering does not stop immediately. In the early stage, the soil is still adjusting, and the chips themselves are dry. But over time, as moisture begins to stay in the ground longer, you will notice a change. The intervals between watering become longer. The urgency fades. You are no longer reacting to dryness every day. Compared to buying bags of mulch from a store, the difference in cost becomes clear very quickly. A single load of wood chips can cover a large area, something that would otherwise require many bags and a significant expense. And unlike thin layers that break down quickly, this system is designed to last and improve over time. There is no special tool required, no complicated schedule, just a layer, placed with intention, and left to do what natural systems have always done. That simplicity is what makes it reliable, especially for a backyard where time and resources are limited. The results do not arrive all at once. They show up in small, steady ways that become more noticeable as the season moves forward. In the first couple of weeks, you may not see much from above. The plants look similar. The beds look recently covered. But if you pay attention to the soil itself, you begin to notice a difference. When you reach under the layer, the ground is not as dry as it used to be. Even after a warm day, there is still some moisture held in place. After a few more weeks, the pattern becomes clearer. You are watering less often, not because you decided to, but because the soil no longer demands it as frequently. The surface is no longer exposed, so the daily loss slows down. Water stays where it is needed. The roots begin to experience a more consistent environment, and that stability shows up in the way the plants grow. Not in sudden bursts, but in steady, even development. By the middle of the season, the change in workload is usually the first thing people notice. The garden does not call for attention in the same urgent way. You are not checking moisture levels every afternoon. You are not rushing out with a hose at the first sign of heat. The system has started to buffer those extremes. That does not mean you never water, but it means you are no longer tied to a daily routine that feels like maintenance. The soil itself also begins to change in texture. Under the layer, it becomes softer and easier to work with. It holds together without becoming compacted. It breaks apart without turning to dust. That balance between air and moisture is what allows roots to move more freely. And when roots can move, they can access more of what they need without depending on constant input from above. Weeds, which used to appear quickly in bare soil, tend to slow down. Some still come through, but they are fewer and easier to manage. Without direct light reaching the surface, many seeds simply do not get the signal to grow. That reduces another source of ongoing work and allows you to focus more on the plants you actually want to keep. As the months pass, the layer of wood chips begins to settle and break down slowly from the bottom. This is not a fast process, and that is a good thing. It feeds the soil gradually, adding organic matter in a way that supports long-term structure rather than short bursts of fertility. You are not adding nutrients in spikes. You are building a base that continues to improve with time. By the end of the season, the difference is no longer subtle. The garden feels more stable. It requires less constant correction. It holds moisture longer. It recovers more easily from heat. And perhaps most importantly, it no longer feels like something that depends entirely on your daily effort to survive. This is where the larger benefit becomes clear. You are not just saving water or time. You are building a system that reduces your dependence on outside inputs. Fewer trips to the store, fewer adjustments during the week, less pressure to keep everything perfectly managed at all times. The garden begins to function more like a living system and less like a project that needs constant attention. That shift does not happen overnight, but once it begins, it tends to continue. Each season builds on the last. The soil improves, the workload stays manageable, and the space you are working with becomes something you can rely on, not something you have to constantly rescue. After a full season, what stays with you is not just the visible growth. It is the feeling that the garden has become quieter, less reactive, less dependent on daily correction. You begin to trust it in a different way because it is no longer shifting so quickly with every change in weather. The soil holds steady. The plants follow that stability, and your role becomes more about observation than constant intervention. That is an important change. When a system works, you do not feel the need to keep adjusting it. You spend less time fixing and more time noticing. You start to see patterns. How the soil stays cool even on hot days. How moisture remains a little longer after a light rain. How the plants move through the season without the same signs of stress you used to expect. It also changes how you think about resources. Water becomes something you manage more carefully, not because it is scarce, but because you are no longer wasting it. Inputs from the store become less central because the soil is beginning to support itself. Over time, that leads to a kind of independence that many people are looking for, but rarely find through quick solutions. This is not about doing everything perfectly. It is about setting up one part of the system correctly and allowing it to carry some of the weight. A single bed covered properly can show you the difference within one season. You do not need to convert your entire backyard at once. In fact, it is often better to start small, observe, and adjust based on what you see. If you decide to try it, keep it simple. Choose one area, apply a proper layer, pay attention to how the soil behaves over time. Notice how often you feel the need to water and how that changes as the weeks pass. Let the results guide you rather than forcing expectations onto the process. There is a tendency to look for complicated answers when something is not working, but sometimes the solution is closer to what has always worked, just applied with intention. A covered soil is a protected soil, and a protected soil is far more capable of supporting life without constant input. You may still water, you may still adjust, but you will likely find that the urgency fades. The garden becomes something you work with, not something you struggle against. And that is usually the point where growing food starts to feel less like a task and more like a steady, reliable part of your everyday life.